Hello, this is Law and Terrorism, the podcast series. I'm your professor, Glenn Torres-Spelliscy. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining me for this week's podcast. The topic this week relates to the war in Afghanistan, and because of the nature of this week's topic, I'm going to vary from the typical 5 key questions approach we've been using and provide more of a narrative tale of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. I hope you enjoy, and if you have any questions, please let me know.
And in a sense, the sort of the theme that comes through repeatedly for me is that 9/11 changed everything. It changed the way we think about threats to the United States. It changed about our recognition of our vulnerabilities. It changed in terms of the kind of national security strategy we need to pursue in terms of guaranteeing the safety and security of the American people. So on the one hand, I'm sure everybody wants to get back to normal, and we have in many respects. But on the other hand, we all have to recognize as a nation that 9/11 changed a great deal in our lives.
The stability that had characterized the post-Cold War era in the United States would be lost on that morning in September. Now, there were changes that every American experienced in their daily lives, including enhanced security measures at airports and places of business. But there was also a fundamental shift in how we understood the world from a legal perspective. And this shift was perhaps most evident in the ways that the United States sought to respond to the attacks. The non-state extremist group Al-Qaeda had planned and carried out the attacks, but they would not be the only party to be held responsible by the United States. In October 2001, the United States invaded the nation of Afghanistan, initiating a paradigm shift in how international law dealt with conflicts involving both state and non-state actors. Prior to the engagement in Afghanistan, states were generally not considered responsible for the actions of non-state actors, even when those actors were operating from within their territory. And this was based on the international legal doctrine of imputability, which provides that states can only be held responsible for acts that were either committed under their authority or at least under the color of their authority. If you had a bad actor on your soil, traditionally the sole duty imposed on the state was the obligation to try to arrest those individuals accused of the crimes, if circumstances permitted. But with the advent of the War on Terror, this old understanding changed. In the new international paradigm ushered in by the Bush administration in the wake of the attacks, states were now to be held responsible for actions of non-state actors who were simply on their territory. And that was a new understanding in international law. The idea was that even the mildest support could and should lead to culpability.
The Taliban must act, and act immediately. They will hand over the terrorists, or they will share in their fate. The enemy of America is not our many Muslim friends. It is not our many Arab friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
Now, importantly, this was not always the U.S. position. As is discussed in the written lecture, the responsibility of states for terrorist activities had previously been limited by the International Court of Justice. In a case called Nicaragua versus the United States, the Nicaraguan government had sued the United States for supporting anti-communist rebel groups, known as the Contras. Now, the Contras were responsible for numerous war crimes, and the Nicaraguan government had sought to hold the U.S. responsible for supporting the group through funding and training. The ICJ, however, held that support was not enough, and for decades the international community accepted that premise, that a state could not be held responsible for the actions of non-state actors unless they had effective control over the actor, which is a much higher standard than support. But that changed with the invasion of Afghanistan. Now, for the first time, a major nation was arguing that support alone could lead to responsibility. Now, the story of Al-Qaeda in the United States is a complicated one, and too many politicians resort to meaningless platitudes simply saying that Al-Qaeda hates our freedoms. The conflict has much more complicated and deep roots. It begins with the rise of the Mujahideen, a non-state actor that sought to expel the Soviet Union from Afghanistan in the 1980s. The U.S., under Presidents Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, supported the efforts of the Mujahideen through arms and supplies, with the purpose of destabilizing and undermining Soviet influence in the region. Now, one of the mujahideen that fought in Afghanistan was the son of a wealthy Saudi family, Osama bin Laden. The end of the Soviet invasion led to a civil war in Afghanistan, and the Taliban ultimately emerged as victorious in 1996. At about the same point in time that the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan, they began to forge increasing ties with another militant Islamic group, Qaeda, which was being led by bin Laden. In the years following the Soviet withdrawal, bin Laden had become enraged at U.S. policies toward Arab states in the Middle East, in particular the presence of the United States troops in Saudi Arabia and the effects of sanctions on the Muslim populations in Iraq. Throughout the 1990s, bin Laden issued a series of fatwas against U.S. interests and civilians seeking to change U.S. policies. Then, in 1998, al-Qaeda was directly responsible for attacks on U.S. embassies in Africa. In 2000, it attacked the USS Cole anchored in Yemen. And the attacks culminated in 2001 with the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The U.S. response was Operation Enduring Freedom. When Operation Enduring Freedom was launched in October 2001, the game plan of the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs, General Casey, was to have a light footprint with only a minimal number of U.S. troops. But Afghanistan, as the Soviets had learned, would not be easily conquered. As violence increased, the U.S. began a surge of troops to the region, culminating in newly elected President Barack Obama's decision to send an additional 50,000 troops in 2009, raising the total to nearly 100,000. That surge would continue until 2011, when a few months after, President Obama had announced the killing of Osama bin Laden by U.S. Special Forces in Pakistan, he announced the start of a planned withdrawal of U.S. troops.
Starting next month, we will be able to remove 10,000 of our troops from Afghanistan by the end of this year, and we will bring home a total of 33,000 troops by next summer, fully recovering the surge I announced at West Point. After this initial reduction, our troops will continue coming home at a steady pace as Afghan security forces move into the lead. Our mission will change from combat to support. By 2014, this process of transition will be complete, and the Afghan people will be responsible for their own security.
Now, this is a critical moment in the policy debate. The killing of bin Laden by U.S. Special Forces was the culmination, not the beginning, of the mission against al-Qaeda. Even before the Obama administration tracked down bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, U.S. forces had already severely degraded al-Qaeda's capabilities and leadership. The organization was a shell of its former self, and for many in the Obama administration, including Vice President Biden, the killing of bin Laden was a significant milestone and signified a transition in the mission. The U.S., though, maintained that it would not abandon Afghanistan, as it had been accused of doing following the Soviet War, which ultimately led to the Taliban seizing power. Rather, the U.S. would pursue a gradual withdrawal strategy, eventually transferring full power to the elected Afghan government and leaving a well-trained and well-equipped Afghan military to defend the country. The end goal of the U.S. policy was to leave a stable Afghanistan that was no longer a refuge for extremist non-state actors like al-Qaeda. It was the Obama administration that first entertained the possibility that peace with the Taliban might be possible, given certain conditions, and negotiations begun shortly. The Trump administration would continue the policy, and after years of fitful negotiations, it was the Trump administration that finally successfully negotiated a peace agreement with the Taliban. In January of 2019, U.S. Chief Negotiator Zalmay Khalilzad announced that, quote, American and Taliban officials have agreed in principle to the framework of a deal in which the insurgents would guarantee Afghan territory is never used by terrorists, which could lead to a full pullout of American troops and return to larger concessions from the Taliban. And then on February 29, 2020, a peace agreement between the Taliban and the United States was signed, proposing a way to end the nearly 2 decades of conflict between the parties. The U.S. promised a full withdrawal by May 1, 2021, in return for promises that the Taliban would never again allow its territory to be used by non-state extremist actors that sought to attack the U.S. or its interests. Now, the U.S.-Taliban peace deal was to be only the first step of the process. The next key phase was to be negotiations between the elected Afghan government and the Taliban to bring an end to the long-running civil war. And this is where the potential for peace was lost. The Taliban showed no real interest in reaching a negotiated settlement with the sitting Afghan government. Negotiations were delayed from the outset, and the Trump administration was not able to push the peace process forward in any significant way. And as the Biden administration assumed power in January 2021, and with the May 1, 2021 deadline approaching and negotiations between the two warring sides stalled, the new president was faced with a choice: to genuinely respect the terms of the agreement and continue the U.S. withdrawal, or to re-engage with the Taliban in another bloody spring offensive. President Biden announced his intention in April 2021, stating that although the U.S. would not meet the May 1st deadline imposed in the peace agreement, the U.S. would complete a full troop withdrawal by the 20th anniversary of the September 11, 2001 attacks. Let's listen to President Biden announce the new plan.
We delivered justice to bin Laden a decade ago, and we've stayed in Afghanistan for a decade since. Since then, our reasons for remaining in Afghanistan have become increasingly unclear, even as the terrorist threat that we went to fight evolved. Over the past 20 years, the threat has become more dispersed, with the terror threat now in many places, keeping thousands of troops grounded and concentrated in just one country at a cost of billions each year makes little sense to me and to our leaders. We cannot continue the cycle of extending or expanding our military presence in Afghanistan, hoping to create ideal conditions for the withdrawal and expecting a different result. I'm now the fourth United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility on to a fifth. When I came to office, I inherited a diplomatic agreement duly negotiated between the government of the United States and the Taliban that all U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just 3 months after my inauguration. That's what we inherited, that commitment. It's perhaps not what I would have negotiated myself, but it was an agreement made by the United States government, and that means something. So in keeping with that agreement and with our national interest, the United States will begin our final withdrawal, begin it on May 1 of this year. U.S. troops, as well as forces deployed by our NATO allies and operational partners, will be out of Afghanistan before we mark the 20th anniversary of that heinous attack on September 11th.
Now, as the U.S. began to withdraw its forces in May 2021, the Taliban seized the opportunity and began to conquer new territory. President Biden stood by his decision.
So let me ask those who want us to stay. How many thousands more Americans' daughters and sons were you willing to risk? How long would you have them stay? Already we have members of our military whose parents fought in Afghanistan 20 years ago. Would you send their children and their grandchildren as well? Would you send your own son or daughter? After 20 years, $1 trillion spent training and equipping hundreds of thousands of Afghan national security and defense forces. 2,448 Americans killed, 20,722 more wounded, and untold thousands coming home with unseen trauma to their mental health. I will not send another generation of Americans to war in Afghanistan with no reasonable expectation of achieving a different outcome.
And with American withdrawal seemingly guaranteed, the Taliban picked up the pace of their attacks, venturing further and further into government-controlled territory all over the country. On August 2, 2021, Afghan President Ghani addressed the parliament, acknowledging the Taliban's advances and blaming the U.S. withdrawal for the precarious situation in the country.
ما د امریکا جمهور رئیس ته ویل چې پریکړه ته درناوی لرم ځکه د هغوی فیصله وه خو زه پوهېدم چې دا پریکړه ځینې پایلې لري او د خطرونو مدیریت به د افغانانو په غاړه واچول سي.
4 days later, the Taliban seized control of the provincial capital of the Nimruz province, and within days, Kabul was surrounded. By August 15, 2021, the Taliban had once again seized control of Kabul, and President Ghani had fled the country. The U.S. began an unprecedented airlift and evacuation to rescue U.S. citizens and local allies, eventually flying over 100,000 people to safety in only 2 weeks. By August 31, 2021, the U.S. had concluded the formal evacuation mission and had fully withdrawn. That night, President Biden once again addressed the nation.
Last night in Kabul, the United States ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. We completed one of the biggest airlifts in history, with more than 120,000 people evacuated to safety. That number is more than double what most experts thought were possible. No nation has ever done anything like it in all of history. Only the United States had the capacity and the will and ability to do it, and we did it today. In April, I made a decision to end this war. As part of that decision, we set the date of August 31st for American troops to withdraw. The assumption was that more than 300,000 Afghan national security forces that we had trained over the past 2 decades and equipped would be a strong adversary in their civil wars with the Taliban. That assumption that the Afghan government would be able to hold on for a period of time beyond military drawdown turned out not to be accurate.
The pace of the Taliban victory had been staggering, and the lack of pushback by the Afghan military had been sobering. For the past 2 decades, 4 administrations, Democrat and Republican, had spent American time, blood, and resources in an attempt to establish a stable democracy in the country, and it had all collapsed in mere weeks. One of the things to ponder is what lessons can be learned about the conflict and the way it ended, with respect to limits of American military and diplomatic power. In the post-9/11 era, the U.S. engaged in a series of wars and conflicts designed to root out terrorist actors and the states that supported them. These missions morphed into policies that sought to impose democratic structures following military conflict. We saw this in Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and in almost every situation the policy failed, and we need to think as a nation about why that is, and what effects it should have on our future foreign policy choices. Well, that's it for today's introductory podcast. Go on to read the materials for this week, and I will see you on the discussion boards.